Hi, I'm B from Nectar, and in today's video, we're going to be making my very own Spider-Man mask. So I wanted to make a Spider-Man mask for a very long time. I did make one back in 2019, but that was more of an Iron Spider mask, and it also wasn't when I was particularly great at doing cosplay stuff, so I want to try it again. To start off with, I'm going to be making the face shell. Now, for those that don't know, a face shell is basically a either cardboard or plastic shell that goes around your face that keeps it in the right Spider-Man-y shape. So I'm kind of over-engineering my face shell. See, I started off with using a 3D scan I took of myself a little while back. I've then proportionately scaled that up so that it matches my IRL height, so all the other dimensions should be the same. Then, I start 3D modeling all around it, and for this, I'm using Blender 3D. It's a great piece of CAD that could do basically anything, and I'm pretty good at it. So I make sure I've got some reference images. I'm doing the PS4 Spider-Man, takes all the best elements of the movies and the comics and just combines it into a lovely design. Now, the face shell is very easy to get wrong. The chin can look too puffy, the head can look too big or small. Proportions are really key. So I start off with trying to match the reference material as much as I can, but seeing as those are 2D images, it's actually easier to just do it by eye and see what looks right. I also gotta stress, this is inspired by the game, but it's not meant to be one-to-one like the game. So I'm not too fussed if it doesn't look exactly the same. Eventually, I get the face shell looking about right, and it's time to do the lenses. The lenses, I'm actually using a shrink wrap modifier, so they'll follow the contour of the face shell. Meaning that way when I make them later, they'll all just line up perfectly. I must admit, working with the shrink wrap is a little bit tricky because it wants to pull the model in ways you wouldn't expect, and there's an awful lot of cleanup I found, seeing as it was the first time I was properly using it in something. Now you might expect me to 3D print these, but actually I want to export them as paper templates so that I can make them out of cardboard. It's cheaper, quicker, and not so bad if I mess it up. Before we do this, we need to add a triangulate modifier and apply it to the model, because Blender hates twisted normals when it goes to export the paper models. I don't fully know what those are. I think it's when a flat face has the corners facing in ways that physically is impossible. So the triangulate modifier just adds some extra creases to let it form that shape. Once that's done, I mark the seams of where I want each cut to be, and I hit export. The scaling was perfect first try. So I traced it out onto some cardboard, started cutting it out. I'm just using cereal box cardboard because it's thin, and the plasticky side gives it a bit of extra strength. Also means there's no corrugations like on standard cardboard, so it's just smooth. The back half of the helmet, it fit over my head, it was the right shape, it was doing great. For the face of the helmet though, Blender decided to be helpful. You see, it thought, instead of just cutting out into 3 pieces like I wanted, it would cut it out into about, I don't know, half a dozen tiny little individual pieces. Normally this wouldn't be an issue because people would label it with numbers and stuff and line up the numbers. But when I did that, because of how many creases and shapes in my model, because this is way more complex than the paper template is really meant to be used for, it just had over 1 million little numbers. So I spent about 2 hours playing the worst jigsaw puzzle game of my life, and eventually had enough of the template that I could piece it together. I was still missing a little bit in between the eyes, but I had enough of the model that I could just make up a new piece by hand and it would fit right. It also made the eye holes way bigger than I originally intended, so I just filled those in by hand as well. Now, these do not need to be perfectly symmetrical because we're going to put the eye lenses over the top anyway. So now that we have the base cardboard shape, it's time to smooth it out. To start with, I did paper mache and watered down PVA glue. The PVA glue dries kind of plasticky and it gives it a lot of extra strength, and the paper mache squares helps to sort of smooth it over. And when it's dry, you can actually sand it. What I did find though after the first couple layers is that this was going to take an awful long time with paper mache, so I swapped over to wood filler. This did use up a lot of wood filler and it's only really meant for smaller projects, but it worked for what I needed. So once I smoothed it out as best as I could by hand with the wood filler, I then got out the sanding block and went to town. Now, I don't particularly love sanding, and what with actually having a fairly short deadline for this project, I decided good enough was good enough for me. Now you might notice that some of the texture is a little bit weird, some of where the wood filler's not quite reaching all the spots. That's fine, we're going to be covering it with fabric. Now, the fabric has a shiny side and a red inside. You might wonder, why don't I just choose the standard red one? And it's because that one let more light through, which meant you could actually see the cardboard through it. While we're not going to be seeing the metallic side at all, because it's thicker, it covers that, meaning I don't need to paint the face shell as well. Now, I tried to be clever, making a template for the fabric. I covered the face shell in plaster wrap, covered him in duct tape, and then flattened that, cut it all out into individual pieces, traced it onto the fabric, and tried to sew it up. And that overly complicated template ended up coming out like this. It wasn't really usable, and I basically over-engineered it. So with the help of my awesome sewer mum, we made this template, which is, as you can see, a lot simpler, and we could just flip it for both sides and sew it together and stretch it over the top of the face shell. Now yes, I'm aware this looks terrifying, but this is working, this is good. So now it's time for the webs. I actually drew with pencil over the face shell, freehanding the webs, because the face shell had changed enough from the 3D model that I couldn't just reuse that and make the web patterns off of that. Once I'd finished drawing the webs, it was time to somehow convert them into a flat template. Now at first I thought about tracing it with painter's tape, but that was way too weak. So in the end, I had to cover the entire thing in plastic wrap again and trace it with thin strips of duct tape. Then once I'd finished tracing it, I flattened it all out on the table and cut out all the plaster wrap in between. Now I tried tracing this directly onto some cardboard and seeing if I could use that for the webs, but they looked really thick and they didn't actually contour to the shape very well. So in the end, I decided that I was going to have to do it with foam. Now my original cardboard web line got destroyed because it was so thin from being so weak, so I had to re-transfer it onto some cardstock, trying my best to keep the invert pristine, and then I could trace that onto the foam, flip it, trace it again, and have the webs as all one solid piece. Now this is just 3mm craft foam, and it worked perfectly. After all that, I had the webs finished, so it's time to give it a spray paint of black paint, and same for the lenses. Then, I dry brushed both with a little bit of white just to give it a bit of weathering and texture. Now we're nearly ready for our final assembly, but first the lenses need filling in. For that, I used a thin piece of plastic to give it a nice sort of sheen. Then, I got 2 pieces of mesh, spray painted them silver, and overlaid them slightly so that the holes between them were just a little bit smaller. You can still see through it, but people can't see your eyes, which is a good thing. Now it is time for the final assembly. We've got all the pieces sorted, and this is actually terrifying. You see, the reason it's particularly terrifying is because the only glue that worked on the fabric after lots of tests was hot glue. I tried super glue, PVA glue, that sort of stuff. All of it was too slippy, and it just made a mess. Hot glue is also messy, but not if you go extremely slow. So I spent about an entire afternoon just meticulously gluing on web lines, trying my best to wrap it around, not tear any. They were so thin and fragile. And of course, if you got a single mess of hot glue, that's welded to the fabric, and even if you try your best, it'll still show. Thankfully though, after taking my time as best as I could, I managed to get all the webs on. So, after one of the most stressful afternoons of my life, I completed the final assembly. So, let's not keep you waiting any longer and show you the final results. That's some of my best work, isn't it? I definitely think that if I used laser cutters and 3D printers, I could get it neater, but for freehand, this is really good. I'm so glad I used that thin layer of plastic over the lenses just to give it that correct shine. The fit is perfect, which is great because it means I can reuse that 3D model of me for any other cosplay, and it should hopefully work. And altogether, I think this is just one of my best masks that I've ever made. I just think everything came out really well. So what do you think? Let me know down in the comments because I'm really proud of this, and I kind of want to do some more Spider-Man related stuff. So if you like what you saw and you want to see more, feel free to subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Farewell! Bye.